Some people move into a new home hoping for peace and community, but we unknowingly stepped into the twisted kingdom of a woman who saw herself as the queen of our quiet. I gotcha, Sock. From the moment we arrived in the upscale community of Foxglove Ridge, my wife Laura and I noticed subtle signs that something wasn't quite right. There were the friendly notes on neighbors' doors, the rules whispered in hushed tones at block parties, and of course, the omnipresent glare of one woman, Margaret Collins. She was the president of the HOA, but if you'd asked her, she'd claim she was the last line of defense against chaos itself. Our golden retriever, Daisy, had been the first point of contention. She was gentle, well-trained, and loved nothing more than rolling around in the freshly cut grass of our new backyard. But apparently, her presence violated some unspoken law. Margaret stormed over on our second day, clipboard in hand, voice laced with righteous authority, and declared our dog a potential danger to the community. Laura, ever composed, offered to show the required permits and vet records. But Margaret wasn't interested in paperwork-only power. That was the day I realized that Margaret didn't enforce rules, she created them, twisted them, weaponized them. She believed herself to be the judge, jury, and enforcer of our peaceful little town. Anyone who didn't bow to her would be swiftly made an example of. The next week was a blur of false complaints and escalating harassment. Margaret filed a noise complaint because Daisy barked at a squirrel once. She accused us of violating lawn ordinances because our grass was allegedly 1 inch too high, despite our yard being professionally landscaped. Then came the letter. Red ink, bold font, and an ultimatum. Remove the dog or face escalating fines and community action. God, it felt less like an HOA notice and more like a mob threat wrapped in official stationery. We tried diplomacy, even invited Margaret for coffee, but she declined with a curt smile and the kind of condescension that made your skin crawl. Rules are rules, she said, and I am their keeper. But Laura was far from ordinary. What Margaret didn't know, and what I hadn't even known until that moment, was that my wife wasn't just an office administrator like she'd led everyone to believe. She was the newly appointed chief of police for our town. Having transferred from the city after a long and distinguished career, she had deliberately kept her identity quiet, observing the neighborhood's dynamics before revealing her position. And now, with the harassment reaching critical mass, she was ready to act. That evening, after yet another bogus violation notice appeared taped to our door, Laura calmly began compiling evidence. She didn't yell. She didn't threaten. She simply opened her laptop, pulled out a small recording device, and began documenting every interaction. This isn't just neighborhood politics anymore, she said softly. This is targeted harassment. The following morning, Margaret escalated even further. She stormed onto our property with a clipboard and a tape measure, shouting about fence violations and unauthorized building modifications. She claimed our recently renovated barn was a code violation, despite our permits being filed and approved. I tried reasoning with her, but she snapped. I've lived here for 20 years. I know what's right and what isn't. It was like trying to argue with a traffic light. Then she called 911 on us. She claimed our dog was aggressive, our home a hazard, and our behavior threatening. Within minutes, Officer Brent arrived. Expected skepticism, but instead he began questioning Laura as if she were the problem. Laura, always calm, presented him with the permits, the video footage, and a badge. Officer Brent blinked. Your Chief Carter? He asked, horror washing over his face. Since Monday, she said evenly, the shift in the atmosphere was immediate. Brent excused himself, called his superior, and returned with an apology so swift it nearly knocked the wind out of me. Had unknowingly tried to reprimand his own boss because of a lying HOA president. But Laura didn't press charges then. She was patient, strategic. She told Officer Brent she would be conducting a full review of Margaret's history with local authorities, including every 911 call, every complaint, every accusation. Margaret, meanwhile, strutted down our street like she'd won a war. She didn't yet know that she'd just declared one with someone who had the power and evidence to dismantle her entire reign. That night, as the sky darkened over Foxglove Ridge, Laura sat at the kitchen table with a folder full of HOA records and a look I hadn't seen since her days in undercover narcotics. Determined, focused. "We're not just cleaning up a neighborhood," she said. "We're setting a precedent."
Ow.
Margaret Collins is about to learn what real authority looks like. The following week marked a quiet but deliberate shift in the atmosphere around Foxglove Ridge. What had once been Margaret Collins, a dominion ruled by fear and wrapped in tight regulations, was now under a slow, methodical investigation, led by someone who not only understood the law, but embodied it. Laura had begun compiling her report, but she didn't do it alone. Within 3 days of her encounter with Officer Brent, she had contacted the city zoning office, the records department, and even the public works office. The findings that poured in were more alarming than even she had anticipated. Margaret had filed over 90 formal complaints in the past 18 months alone, more than the rest of the HOA combined in 5 years. Of those complaints, a full third had been directed at new residents, young families, or anyone who had disagreed with her during HOA meetings. Worse yet, multiple calls to 911 had been traced back to her address, each one carefully phrased to exaggerate harmless situations: suspicious figures loitering a delivery guy checking a GPS, unauthorized vehicle blocking the sidewalk, a neighbor parking half an inch too close to a curb, aggressive animal behavior, a leashed puppy wagging its tail. Laura documented each call and paired it with surveillance footage, incident logs, and HOA newsletters. Every time Margaret had accused someone of non-compliance, Laura could now match it with proof that there had been no actual violation. But that wasn't the only concern. As Laura dug deeper into the HOA structure, she realized Margaret had been misusing her power for far more than personal vendettas. Margaret had, over the years, consolidated control over every HOA committee elections, to budgeting, landscaping, and even social events. Her signature was on every contract, every vendor renewal, and every fine issued in the past 3 years. What stood out the most, however, was a specific line item in the HOA budget: community safety monitoring, $14,500. That amount had been approved without community vote, and there was no clear documentation on where the money had gone. Laura submitted a records request through official channels. When no documentation arrived, she filed a subpoena through the city attorney's office under her jurisdiction. 2 days later, the documents showed up hastily printed, barely legible, and highly suspicious. The community safety monitoring funds had been funneled to a private LLC called Red Pines Community Services, a company registered to an out-of-state P.O. box with no listed contact information. A further search linked the LLC to a secondary address, an empty office suite 3 towns over, the single name associated with its lease: Margaret Collins. Laura now had evidence not only of harassment, but of financial fraud. Meanwhile, the tone among the residents was shifting. A few brave neighbors began visiting Laura after dark, quiet knocks at the door, anxious glances over shoulders. They brought stories, each one more disturbing than the last. One couple said Margaret had entered their backyard without permission, claiming to inspect a fencing concern, but really photographing their patio setup. Another neighbor, an elderly woman, admitted she'd been fined multiple times for decorative garden gnomes that violated uniform aesthetic code, though the rule itself didn't exist in writing. One man claimed Margaret had threatened to revoke his community pool access after he refused to vote her way during an HOA election. These weren't just personality clashes, they were patterns of control. Laura cataloged every testimony, cross-verified dates and documents, and began constructing a legal strategy. Margaret's grip on Foxglove Ridge was unraveling, but not without resistance. Sensing the shift in energy, Margaret doubled down on her tactics. She mailed anonymous letters to the board, alleging Laura had lied on her residency forms. She filed a formal complaint to the city council, accusing Laura of abusing her police authority. She even sent a cease and desist letter via a private attorney warning of personal liability should the investigation continue. But Laura wasn't rattled. She had dealt with gang leaders, political bribes, and corruption task forces. Rogue HOA president was not going to shake her. The cease and desist was handed over to the city legal department, who promptly informed Margaret she had no jurisdiction over internal police reviews. The complaint to the city council was dismissed. Within a day, due to lack of standing and false information, and when Margaret called 911 again this time, claiming there was a suspicious wire running from Laura's garage to a public utility box, the responding officers were already briefed. They arrived, rolled their eyes, filed a report, and left. Margaret was losing control, and for the first time, the neighborhood could see it. Her posture at HOA meetings became rigid. Her smiles grew forced. The fear she used to command was replaced by side eyes and hushed murmurs. When she barked at a child for riding a scooter on the sidewalk, 3 parents immediately stepped in. When she threatened to fine a family for flying a small flag from their porch, they laughed and waved to their Ring camera. And still, Margaret continued to spiral. She posted lengthy, passive-aggressive updates on the HOA message board, warning of rising lawlessness and outsider influence corrupting their peaceful neighborhood. But no one responded. The next HOA meeting was the tipping point. Laura attended quietly, not as a police chief, but as a resident. The room was packed. For the first time, people who never showed up before were sitting side by side. Margaret began her usual speech, full of coded language about standards and discipline. Then Laura stood up and calmly presented her findings. She didn't accuse, she didn't shout, she simply laid out the facts: misused funds, unauthorized 911 calls, fabricated violations, in a paper trail of corruption that ended with Margaret's signature. As she spoke, gasps echoed around the room. Margaret's face flushed. She interrupted, tried to spin it as a smear campaign. But Laura kept going unshaken, professional, thorough. And when she finally concluded, she submitted her report too. The board informed them of her intention to press criminal charges. Margaret stormed out. The room sat in stunned silence. But then, slowly, people began to clap. It wasn't loud. It wasn't raucous. It was steady, unified, and it carried something deeper than applause. It carried relief. The next morning, a petition circulated demanding Margaret's immediate resignation. Over 2/3 of the neighborhood signed it within 24 hours. The HOA board, under immense pressure and backed by mounting legal evidence, voted to suspend her indefinitely pending further investigation. For the first time in years, Margaret Collins was no longer in control. The power she'd clutched so tightly had crumbled not with rage but with truth, persistence, and a neighborhood waking up from years of fear. But Laura knew this wasn't the end. Margaret was many things: stubborn, arrogant, manipulative, but she was not stupid. People like her didn't just give up. They retaliated. And somewhere deep down, Laura was already preparing for what came next. Geraldine Prescott's fall from grace wasn't just swift, it was surgical. The evidence Laura presented at that final HOA board meeting had not only stripped her of her power, but also exposed her to potential criminal charges. Still, Laura wasn't finished. She knew that simply removing a corrupt figurehead didn't fix the rot underneath. And so she pushed forward with a formal investigation to ensure Geraldine's actions had consequences beyond mere embarrassment. The following morning, dressed in her full police uniform, Laurel walked confidently up the porch steps of Geraldine's home at exactly 9 a.m., just as promised. The sight of her in official attire badge gleaming in the morning sun, holstered sidearm, and polished boots transformed her from the neighbor Geraldine had tormented to the authoritative presence of the law. Geraldine, now stripped of her bluster, answered the door in a bathrobe, hair frazzled, looking like she hadn't slept in days. Gone was the commanding voice and smug posture. What stood in the doorway now was a woman grappling with the weight of her own undoing. "Chief Carter," she whispered, barely audible. Laura remained calm and professional. "Mrs. Prescott, I'm here in my official capacity to discuss your documented behavior over the last 20 months. With that, she entered the house and laid out a folder so thick it looked like a textbook. Inside, logs of 13 false police reports, community testimonies from neighbors who had been bullied into silence, and financial inconsistencies tied to HOA funds misused under Geraldine's leadership. Each item was presented methodically, with a kind of calm precision that made Geraldine's previous hysteria look all the more irrational. Let's review a few of your emergency calls, Laura said, flipping through the file. You dialed 911 because a lemonade stand lacked a food license. You reported a 6-year-old's birthday party as a suspicious gathering. You claimed illegal dumping when a trash lid blew open. You filed noise complaints against basketball-playing teenagers and accused a barbecue of being a riot. This isn't enforcement, it's harassment. Geraldine attempted to stammer out an excuse, something about maintaining standards. But her voice cracked under the weight of the truth. Laura continued, You've used emergency services as a weapon against your own community. Not just unethical, it's criminal. When Laura finally closed the folder, the sound was like a gavel. You have 2 options, she said with unshakable finality. You can resign, list your house, and leave the neighborhood quietly, and we'll handle this administratively. Or you can face charges for filing false reports, harassment, and obstruction of investigations. Your choice. The color drained from Geraldine's face. She swayed slightly, gripping the back of a dining chair to steady herself. Guy, do this to me, she whispered, voice trembling. I've lived here for 15 years. This is my neighborhood. Laura looked her square in the eye. It's not yours anymore. Within days, Geraldine submitted her resignation. A moving truck appeared in her driveway within the week, and her prized lawn decorations were boxed away like evidence. The entire neighborhood watched through. Curtained windows, some cheering silently, others just relieved the storm had passed. The HOA board convened again shortly after and unanimously appointed an interim president, Eleanor James, a soft-spoken widow who'd lived in the neighborhood for over a decade and was widely respected for her fairness and common sense. Under Eleanor's leadership, the HOA started reversing many of Geraldine's fines and policies, issuing public apologies to families she had targeted. The absurd rules about flag colors, lawn gnomes, and mailbox heights were struck from the books. Meetings became civil. Disagreements were handled with dialogue instead of threats. The transformation was immediate and almost surreal. Our home, once a battleground, became a place of peace again. We no longer flinched at the sound of the doorbell or braced ourselves when checking the mailbox. Bella, our gentle golden retriever, roamed freely in the backyard without fear. Neighbors who had previously avoided us out of fear now stopped by to chat. One woman, eyes misty with emotion, said, "Thank you. I was scared to say anything before. But what your wife did gave all of us our voices back." Laura, for her part, returned to her usual quiet routines, content to be a protector from the shadows again. But I knew something had changed in her, too. There was a sense of closure, a silent pride in having used her role not just to enforce the law, but to restore dignity to a community poisoned by fear. Geraldine's exit hadn't erased the damage she caused, but it had reopened the possibility of healing. Still, there were some lingering aftershocks. A few of Geraldine's loyalist residents who'd benefited from her favoritism attempted to stir the pot, suggesting that Laura had used her power unfairly. But they were quickly shut down by facts, and by a neighborhood that had finally found the courage to stand together. One particularly bold man attempted to restart the complaint process, suggesting Laura's presence intimidated board neutrality. But Eleanor calmly read aloud a clause from the HOA charter reaffirming residents' right to hold public office regardless of occupation. When he continued to press, she invited him to submit his complaint in writing, along with documentation. Witnesses, in a public hearing. He declined. That night, sitting on the porch with Laura and Bella, as the sky turned orange and the air carried the scent of summer, I looked at her and said, "Did you ever think it had come to this?" She smiled, tired but satisfied. I hoped it wouldn't. But I knew if it did, I'd be ready. Her words carried the quiet gravity of someone who didn't seek battles, but refused to run from them. As we sat in peaceful silence, the sound of laughter from a neighbor's backyard reminded us of what had been missing and what had now returned. Simple thing, the feeling of home. Geraldine may have seen herself as a queen, but it turned out that even queens can be dethroned, especially when they forget that power without compassion leads only to ruin. By the time the 4th week since Geraldine's resignation rolled around, peace had largely returned to Foxglove Ridge, but not without lingering ripples that revealed just how much her influence had tainted the neighborhood, though Laura's Intervention had halted the abuse of power. The culture of fear Geraldine had embedded in our cul-de-sac didn't vanish overnight. Some neighbors still whispered when they talked about her, casting glances over their shoulders like her ghost might still appear with a clipboard and a citation. But there was also a growing courage, one small act at a time. Lawn decorations started popping up again. People left bicycles in their driveways without panicking. The new HOA leadership even hosted a community barbecue in the Parkcan event. That had been banned by Geraldine for years on account of noise pollution and unapproved gathering permits. It was a modest affair at hot dogs, folding tables, kids with bubble wands, but it felt like a declaration. We were taking our neighborhood back. Still, Laura hadn't closed her investigation. There were loose ends, unexplained patterns in the budget, and 2 anonymous complaints that stood out in her records, ones that bore Geraldine's tone but had been filed under different names. It was enough to keep Laura curious, and in her world, curiosity always led to action. One evening, while Laura reviewed the HOA's archived email correspondence, she noticed something strange. 2 different board members, now retired, logged votes on resolutions that they later swore never reached their inboxes. After a bit of digging, Laura traced the origin of those digital votes to a proxy tool Geraldine had insisted the HOA adopt during the pandemic. Ostensibly, it was meant to make remote meetings easier, but the tool lacked proper authentication. Geraldine had been using it to cast votes on behalf of other board members, forging consensus on rules she wrote herself. This changed everything. It meant some of her most draconian policies, like the surveillance camera rule or the lawn uniformity clause, had never passed the legitimate vote. Laura contacted the city attorney again and requested a digital audit. The report confirmed at least 7 instances of vote tampering, each one implicating Geraldine directly. But that wasn't even the worst of it. While looking through property documents, Laura stumbled upon something deeply unsettling. There were inconsistencies in the deeds. Geraldine had signed as part of her community compliance program a clever label for what now looked like fraudulent property lien threats. At least 2 families had moved out of Foxglove Ridge after receiving legal-looking notices implying their homes would be seized for repeated non-compliance. Those families had never fought the letters, they simply left, believing they were on the verge of foreclosure. Laura called them. One was an elderly couple who had moved into assisted living after being pressured out of their home. The other was a young single mother with a toddler who had relocated out of state. Neither had ever officially been evicted, but the fear of legal trouble, fueled by Geraldine's forged documents, had been enough to push them away. This wasn't just a power-hungry neighbor anymore. This was criminal coercion. Laura gathered all the evidence and submitted it to the district prosecutor's office. Geraldine had resigned from her position, but now she was about to be summoned for a different kind of judgment. At home, things finally started to feel normal. Laura and I resumed work on the barn renovation, and Bella, now the unofficial mascot of justice, trotted around freely, her tail wagging like a flag of victory. Every once in a while, we'd catch someone walking past our house and giving Laura a respectful nod or a grateful wave. Our neighbors knew, even if they didn't say it out loud, that our family had protected theirs. Then one day, while checking our mail, I found an envelope, no stamp, no return address, just a folded piece of legal paper with 6 typed words. This isn't over. You'll regret interfering. The paper smelled faintly of lavender, Geraldine's perfume. I brought it inside, showed it to Laura, who scanned it, and immediately notified the local precinct to file a record. But she didn't react with panic, just resolve. She's trying to rattle us, Laura said, placing the note into a plastic evidence sleeve. But she's forgotten this isn't her game anymore. That night, we installed motion sensor lights and updated our security system. Not out of fear, but out of principle. We weren't going to let a bitter woman haunt us from the shadows. A week later, Laura was invited to speak at the regional HOA accountability seminar, where she presented her findings and warned other communities about the dangers of unchecked authority in residential associations. Her speech, titled "When HOA Turns into Harassment," drew a standing ovation. She was later invited to participate in a state-level task force on neighborhood governance. What had started as a personal nightmare was now becoming a public lesson and a call to reform. Meanwhile, Geraldine's legal troubles caught up with her. Her court date was set for the following month, with multiple charges ranging from fraudulent activity to harassment. The community was informed through an official notice posted to the HOA board website. And for the first time in years, that notice didn't include Geraldine's signature. It bore the mark of the interim president, Eleanor James, who had quickly become a symbol of integrity in our neighborhood. And then, just as life began to settle again, we got a surprise visitor. A sleek black SUV pulled into our driveway one evening, and a sharply dressed woman stepped out holding a leather briefcase. She introduced herself as Agent Rachel Howard from the Department of Community Affairs. "We've been monitoring a pattern of base corruption," she said. "Your neighborhood isn't the first, but your wife's handling of the situation has given us a very compelling case study. We'd like to consult her on future investigations." Laura accepted the invitation, not because she wanted the recognition, but because she knew that if Geraldine's kind of abuse could happen here, it could happen anywhere. And if her experience could help others, then it was her duty to share it. That night, as we sat on the back porch watching the moonlight dance across Bella's golden fur, I looked at Laura and said, "You know, I married a warrior and didn't even know it." She smiled, leaned into me, and whispered, "And you stood by me the whole way." There was no more talk of Geraldine that night, only plans for the future, for our home, our family, and a community that had finally, blessedly, found peace. The weeks that followed brought a quiet sense of triumph across Foxglove Ridge, a feeling both unfamiliar and deeply welcome. The shadows Geraldine had cast for so long seemed to fade with every sunrise, replaced by warm porch lights and voices. Drifting through the trees after dinner, by sidewalk chalk and laughter and simple neighborly kindness, the changes were subtle, but powerful in locked gates, windows left open, kids riding scooters without fear of complaint. The fear that once ruled the neighborhood had been replaced with something far more durable: trust. Geraldine's court appearance came and went with the solemnity of a funeral. The judge, unimpressed by her theatrics and weak attempts to justify her behavior, handed down a sentence that combined fines, a no-contact order for certain residents, and an extensive community service requirement. She wasn't jailed, though. Many believed she should have been, but she was no longer welcome in Foxglove Ridge. Legally barred from holding any HOA or organizational authority in the state for at least a decade. Her house, now sitting on the market, carried a certain weight. Real estate agents quietly advised prospective buyers about the HOA history of the home. And while the inside was polished, the neighborhood's collective memory lingered in the walls. Across the street, a welcome sign bloomed in front of the community garden, something that had been impossible under Geraldine's rule. It read simply, "Neighbors first." Eleanor James continued to lead the HOA with fairness and humility. Board now expanded to include a broader range of voices: single parents, retirees, first-time homeowners, was committed to democratic processes. A new rule required all HOA decisions to be ratified by open vote, and no single person could hold executive authority for more than one term. Transparency replaced secrecy. The community newsletter, once filled with condescending updates and veiled threats, now included birthday shout-outs, dog of the week photos, and resident recommendations for local events. But perhaps the most enduring change was not in structure, it was in spirit. People talked to each other again. Problems were solved through conversations on porches and sidewalks, not passive-aggressive letters. The phrase "that's just HOA policy" was replaced by "let's figure it out together." And through it all, Laura remained at the center, not as a ruler or enforcer, but as a quiet guardian. She continued her role at the department, but now served on 2 statewide advisory boards focusing on HOA, accountability, and neighborhood digital ethics. Her inbox filled weekly with messages from other communities facing similar challenges, some asking for guidance, others simply thanking her for proving that justice was still possible, even in the quiet corners of suburbia. There were invitations for interviews, podcasts, even a feature in a national magazine, but Laura turned most of them down. She didn't want the spotlight, only the change. We watched together as the Sham Stories channel released a special video retelling our experience. Using real audio clips and interviews all cleared legally from the board meetings and neighborhood events. The video quickly went viral, not because of scandal, but because it offered hope that even the smallest injustice could be challenged when good people refused to stay silent. The comments were filled with stories, people from across the country, sharing their own HOA horror tales, their own fights against unreasonable authority, and how our story gave them courage. It felt surreal watching the very nightmare we had lived through become a blueprint for others to rise up against abuse in their communities. But it also felt like closure. Geraldine's name faded from public record quickly. No one mentioned her anymore, not because they forgot, but because they chose to move forward. Her legacy had been overwritten by the collective will of a community that had decided enough was enough.
Ollie,
Now slightly older, remained the joyful constant in our lives. Her tail wagging whenever a new neighbor passed by to pet her or drop off a homemade treat. Her aggressive behavior had long since become a joke, one that people now use to measure just how ridiculous things had once been. One afternoon, as we sat in the park under the newly planted oaks, a young couple approached us with nervous smiles. They had just moved in from out of state, unaware of the history, but quickly sensing the tight-knit strength of the community. "Everyone says this is the safest, kindest place in town," the woman said. "It feels like home already." Laura smiled and nodded. "That's the point," she replied. "It always should have been." Wow. And in that moment, the past felt like something that had been sealed, not erased, but transformed. From fear to resilience. From silence to voice. From a street of isolated homes to a village of open hearts. Geraldine had come close to breaking something sacred. But in trying to control everything, she had reminded us how much stronger we are when we stand together. And if you were moved by this story, if you believe that truth, justice, and community matter more than titles or rules, subscribe to the Sham Story YouTube channel and turn on notifications. Stories like these deserve to be heard, not just remembered. Together, we can make sure no voice is ever silenced again.